30% from your tax credits, 30% from pre-sales and gap financing, and then the other 30% would be the equity.
Can you give us practical strategies for raising money at, let's say, the 100,000 mark, then 1 million mark, and then let's say 10 million and beyond? Maybe we could start at the
Sure.
bottom, 100,000.
Sure. I mean, 100,000, you are typically not involving state tax credits or location-based incentives. So you're probably doing that mostly on just straight equity. So either, a group of people, usually friends or family, you're, cobbling it together, 5,000 here, maybe 10,000 there. Maybe you have someone who's willing to come in for the full amount, but it's typically done, in that fashion, because there's not a lot of leverage you can pull at $100,000 in terms of, tax credits or pre-sales and different things that you might be able to use at the higher levels.
And then would the next sort of benchmark be 1 million? Or I know you talked sort of before about 500,000. But is 1 million really the next step up?
I think anything where you can get a tax credit, a lot of the tax credits start in different states around 200,000 or 300,000 is like the minimum spend that you have to do. And so that's a big part of financing. So if you can make a $300,000 film and get back $100,000 in a state tax credit, that's, you've already got a third of your budget raised. So, and that's interesting for investors because they can know if they're putting up the full amount, if they wait to get the tax credit, they know they're going to get 20 or 30% of their money back, just guaranteed. So it lessens their risk. But at that level, you're still probably talking to individual investors who will put in, write checks, maybe a group of investors to put money in. When you go to the higher levels, and I'd say, it's probably closer to maybe 5 million and up, then the formula changes quite a bit because you're typically, you look at it as thirds, so a third of your budget would be covered by tax credits, and then a third of it would be typically done by pre-sales and gap financing from, various debt lenders. So you're working with a foreign sales company or a company that goes out and can pre-sell, because at that level, hopefully you're getting names that people want, and it's a commercial project and you can pre-sell, it's getting harder and harder. But typically the typical financing ceremony, financial model would be, 30% from your tax credits, 30% from pre-sales and gap financing, and then the other 30% would be the equity. So you're raising that, and typically that's going to be a little more sophisticated investors when you're talking about millions of dollars. So you're talking about maybe some funds, some venture capital companies, or really wealthy individuals that either have a family office or a lot of money and they're investing in film. So, but that rule of thirds is typically what you do on the higher budget ones. Is you want to raise a third out of equity, a third from tax credits, and a third from pre-sales and gap financing.
And what's the typical turnaround time of getting those tax credits back?
It depends on the state. I mean, it's kind of long. I think it's anywhere from a year to could be almost 2 years, I think, in some cases, because you have to present all the, receipts. So you have to get through the whole production, which, can take 6 months or something, submit your receipts, and then, maybe 6 months to a year after that, you can get the payback. A lot of times, though, people will, if they need the money for the production itself, they can monetize the tax credits. So there are banks and debt lenders that will take your tax credits. Say you have, a $500,000 tax credit from Louisiana, and there are companies and banks that will take that $500,000, discount it a little bit, and then loan you back, say, $400,000 that you can then use on your production. And then they'll hold the tax credit until it, gets repaid. And so they're taking a cut of that. So you're getting less money toward your production, but if you need the money up front, you're getting it, by monetizing it.
And do those banks typically work with first-time filmmakers, or does it matter? They look at the whole casting?
They look at the whole package, and so they're really going on sales estimates from foreign sales companies and domestic companies, and they're looking, they want trusted companies to look at those. So those packages, typically you have names in commercial genres, so it's not an unknown cast in a heavy drama that they're going to finance. It'd be typically action with some names, or thriller or horror or something where they can really say, okay, yeah, we've got a company out there that's backing these sales, and they say they're going to do $2 million in international. Well, we'll loan against the unsold territories, along with banking any of the sales that they have if they're with reputable buyers.
So forgive me, I thought it was 100,000 to 1 million to 10 million. So is there really a different spectrum of what these different levels are?
I think, well, first you have to get to that first threshold is where you can get the state tax, credits. So if you're making something for 50,000 or 100,000, I think most of the time you're not going to qualify. So it doesn't become part of the finance model. So you want to hit at least that threshold. And then the next threshold is really the point where you can get, enough names involved that mean something so that you can do pre-sales. And so that's typically nowadays, films, it could be $1.5 million budget, but they have some bankable names in there. But typically you're going higher because the real names now, might cost, for one name, might cost $500,000 to $1 million to a couple $1 million to get them in the film. So typically you're talking about films in the 5 to 10 to 15 or even $20 million range, where you start getting real meaningful pre-sales on them from foreign sales companies, maybe a domestic deal or a backstop here so that they can loan against that as well. And then you're getting these big, tax credits against that spend as well. And then hopefully, the ideal way to make it is not to have any equity, because then you don't have any investors to repay. If you can get enough in pre-sales, if you had a super commercial film with big names that everybody wanted, you could technically, be in profit before you shot it. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So, if you have, A-list, actors and everyone's, cutting their fees, and you're doing this movie that everybody wants, then you could pre-sell more than your budget and be in profit before you shot. But that's extremely rare.
And would you say it's even more rare for the first-time filmmaker?
Yeah, I think a first-time filmmaker is at a disadvantage just because a lot of the names take into account the director that they're working with, and so a lot of them want to work with known directors, ones that they've kind of admired their work before. And so as a first-time director, it's going to be about the script. If an actor looks, it's going to be about the script, and it's really about the money. So if the first-time filmmaker doesn't have a track record, a lot of filmmakers, when they are approaching actors, will write a personal letter to the actor, and explain why they think they're right for the role. Talk about why they respect them as an actor. What films they've seen that inspired them, and why they want to work with them. And that it does help, I think. But at the end of the day, you have a gatekeeper who's an agent or manager who's looking at the project, and the names that everybody wants get a lot of offers. So if you're an unknown director, it's really tough. I think if you're an unknown director, it helps to get a known producer who has the connections, maybe to talent or to at least to agents and managers, where you can get their attention and have a better chance of landing good names for your project.
And what about actors who do a lot of indie films, and maybe they've saturated the market?
Yeah, it happens. If you go to any of the foreign sales markets, you go to Berlin or Cannes or AFM, you see a certain type of film that has the same kind of names in it all the time, and they do get saturated. But the market will withstand a lot. It seems like the demand in certain territories where they're buying those films, it'll reach a saturation point, but it might be. That there's too many this year, but it might go on for several years where it's like they'll take anything you can get. So there's certain names that seem to just be evergreen that they'll always want, and maybe it's because they've chosen their projects carefully. And then there's others that just will do anything, and they oversaturate themselves, and they kind of kill their value because everybody knows, like, oh, they'll do anything, and these movies are really bad, so that they're doing. So I think the smarter actors try to do things that are good quality. They know what is expected, and that way they keep their their brand value high.
What have been the biggest changes you've seen in financing in, let's say, the last 10 years?
Well, the streaming wars were a big part of everything. So there was a lot of money flowing through when, Netflix was kind of rewriting the rules of the business, and all the other studios were falling in line and competing with them. So they were all funding, at incredible levels, projects. And so over the last 10 years, though, things have changed. I think, Netflix has pretty much won the streaming wars, and everybody else had to adjust their, kind of spend, because they couldn't afford to just keep going into debt every year competing with Netflix. So they've all pulled back quite a bit, and, it's changed the ease at which you could get a pre-sale from one of the companies, and just the free spending is kind of over. They're still spending on really big projects, but a lot of the medium-sized projects are not getting made. Whereas, a few years ago, if you had, a big name and a $40 million budget, they were all competing, and they wanted those names, so they would buy it. It was kind of the price of entry and their table stakes for them to compete in the streaming wars. So now that all the studios have kind of learned where their niche is and where they actually need to be to make money. They've all changed, I think, their strategies, and they've cut back a lot in terms of what they're spending. And I think they look at each project very carefully in terms of how much they're going to spend, who's going to be in it, and I think Netflix kind of changed the game when they got into it, and I think they overspent at the beginning, and I think they admit that they overspent to get in the game because they wanted to work with the big names, so they would overpay to get people to come to Netflix and make their projects there, and it was a great success. They brought in all kinds of big top talent to make projects, and they've kind of pulled ahead of everybody of so many global subscribers now that their model still works, but they've gotten more selective. I think all the other streamers have gotten more selective, and it's they're treating it more like a business rather than doing a lot of things that were considered loss leaders to just compete.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.